The morning sun cast long shadows across the riverside shooting range as Marcus Thompson pulled his weathered Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot. The familiar weight of his rifle case pressed against his shoulder as he stepped out, the crisp October air filling his lungs. He'd been coming to this range for 3 years now, ever since moving to the small town of Millbrook, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the other patrons had been looking at him lately, or perhaps it was the whispered conversations that seemed to stop whenever he walked by. Marcus had always been a man of few words, preferring the honest simplicity of breath control and trigger discipline to the complexities of human interaction. At 34, his dark skin bore the subtle marks of a life lived in harsh conditions, a thin scar along his jawline, hands that were calloused in ways that spoke of more than weekend hobby shooting, and eyes that held depths most people never bothered to notice. To the regular crowd at Riverside, he was just another black guy with a gun, probably overcompensating for something, they'd mutter behind his back. The range master, Dale Hutchinson, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle as Marcus approached the counter. Dale was a man whose belly had grown proportionally with his sense of self-importance over the years, his Confederate flag baseball cap sitting askew on his balding head. "Morning, Dale," Marcus said quietly, placing his membership card on the counter. "Yeah, whatever," Dale grunted, not bothering with eye contact. "Lane 7's open. Try not to embarrass yourself too bad today." A few of the other men loitering around the counter chuckled at Dale's comment, their eyes following Marcus as he collected his ear protection and moved toward the lanes. Marcus had heard worse. Much worse. In the mountains of Afghanistan, he'd been called every name in the book by enemies and allies alike. But there was something particularly cutting about the casual racism of suburban shooting ranges, the way it dressed itself up as friendly ribbing while carrying the full weight of centuries of hatred. He set up at lane 7 with practiced efficiency, unpacking his rifle, a custom Remington 700 that he'd modified himself, and arranging his ammunition with the methodical precision of someone for whom such routines had once meant the difference between life and death. The other shooters gave him a wide berth, clustering together at the far end of the range like wolves sizing up unfamiliar prey. "Hey, check this out," came a voice from behind him. Marcus didn't turn around, but he could hear the approach of footsteps. 3 men had wandered over, led by a stocky guy in his 40s wearing a "Don't Tread on Me" t-shirt. His name was Chuck Brennan, and he considered himself the unofficial alpha of the Riverside Range. "You sure you know how to use that thing, boy?" Chuck asked, his voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention from the other lanes. His companions, a thin man named Jerry and a younger guy they called Diesel, snickered appreciatively. Marcus continued his setup routine, checking his scope alignment and adjusting his bipod. He'd learned long ago that engagement often only escalated these situations. In his mind, he could hear the voice of his old commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Mitchell. "Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all, Thompson." "I'm talking to you," Chuck pressed, stepping closer. "This ain't Call of Duty, you know. Real shooting takes skill." Finally, Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting Chuck's pale blue ones with a steadiness that made the other man shift uncomfortably. "I know," Marcus said simply, then returned to his rifle. The dismissal clearly stung Chuck's ego. He glanced back at his friends, who were watching the interaction with the anticipation of schoolyard bullies. "Tell you what, hotshot," Chuck said, his voice rising. "Why don't we make this interesting? Little friendly competition. See who's really got what it takes." Other shooters had begun to take notice now, several removing their ear protection to listen. Dale had even looked up from his crossword, a mean smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Marcus could feel the weight of their expectations, the collective desire to see him fail and confirm their prejudices. "What kind of competition?" Marcus asked quietly. Chuck's grin widened. "Long range. 5 shots at 600 yards. Best group wins. Loser pays for winner's ammo for a month." He paused, letting the challenge sink in. "Unless you're not up for it, of course." 600 yards was serious distance for this range, requiring not just accuracy but deep understanding of ballistics, wind reading, and environmental factors. Most weekend warriors couldn't consistently hit a man-sized target at that distance, let alone shoot tight groups. Chuck was clearly confident in his abilities, and from the way Jerry and Diesel were nodding approvingly, this wasn't his first such challenge. Marcus studied the far target through his scope, automatically calculating variables that had become second nature to him over years of professional application. Wind speed approximately 8 miles per hour from the northwest, temperature 72 degrees Fahrenheit, slight upward slope to the target, atmospheric pressure stable. His mind worked through the adjustments needed with the unconscious competence of someone who had made such calculations under conditions far more stressful than a small-town shooting range. "All right," Marcus said finally. 5 shots, 600 yards. The word spread quickly through the range, and soon a small crowd had gathered to watch the showdown. Money began changing hands as impromptu bets were placed, with the odds heavily favoring Chuck. After all, he was a local favorite with years of competition experience, while Marcus was just some black guy who showed up alone and kept to himself. Chuck shot first, taking his time to set up his own custom rifle, a high-end setup that probably cost more than Marcus made in 2 months at his current job as a night security guard. The first shot rang out, followed by Chuck peering through a spotting scope. "Dead center," he announced with satisfaction. His next 4 shots followed in steady succession, each accompanied by approving murmurs from the crowd. When Chuck finished, they called the target back to examine his group. 5 shots clustered within a roughly 4-inch circle around the bullseye, impressive shooting by any standard. Chuck accepted the congratulations of his friends with obvious pleasure, shooting smug glances toward Marcus. "Your turn, boy," Chuck said, making the last word deliberately patronizing. "Try not to miss the paper entirely." Marcus took his position behind his rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the stock against his shoulder. For a moment, the noise of the range faded away, replaced by memories of Afghan mountainsides and the crystalline clarity that came with life-or-death precision. He'd made shots like this before, but under circumstances where failure meant good men didn't come home. His first shot broke cleanly, the rifle's recoil absorbed through practiced technique. Without looking at the target, he worked the bolt and chambered another round. The second shot followed within 30 seconds, then the third, fourth, and fifth in steady rhythm. The entire sequence took less than 3 minutes, far faster than Chuck's deliberate approach. "Jesus, slow down there, Rambo," someone called out. "This ain't a race." But Marcus wasn't rushing, he was simply operating at the level of proficiency that had once made him one of the most feared snipers in the British Special Air Service. Each shot was the result of years of training that had been refined in the crucible of combat, where hesitation was often fatal and second chances were rare luxuries. When they called Marcus's target back, the initial reaction was silence. The 5 shots formed a group that could be covered by a quarter, clustered so tightly around the center that they had actually begun to cut through each other. It was the kind of shooting that most people saw only in movies, precision that bordered on the impossible. "What the hell?" Chuck muttered, snatching the spotting scope for a closer look. "That can't be right." But it was right, and everyone could see it. Marcus had not only won the competition decisively, he had demonstrated a level of marksmanship that was clearly beyond anything most of them had ever witnessed. The crowd's mood shifted from anticipation to uncomfortable amazement, with several people pulling out their phones to photograph the target. "Lucky shots," Chuck said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably got a hot load or something." Marcus began packing his equipment with the same methodical care he'd used to set it up. He could feel the weight of stares, hear the whispered conversations starting up again, but this time with a different tone. Confusion had replaced condescension, and several people were looking at him with new interest. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" The question came from Jerry, Chuck's usually silent companion, who had stepped forward while Chuck continued to examine the target in disbelief. Marcus paused in his packing. For 3 years, he'd maintained his cover, living quietly and anonymously in this small town while he tried to process the ghosts that had followed him home from a decade of war. His real identity was buried under layers of official secrecy and bureaucratic classification, but that single string of shots had torn away the facade as effectively as any intelligence leak. "Practice," Marcus said simply, shouldering his rifle case. But Jerry wasn't satisfied with that answer, and neither were several others who had witnessed the display. "No, seriously," Jerry pressed. "That was military-level shooting, special forces or something." The range had grown quiet now, with even the other lanes ceasing fire as word spread about what had just happened. Marcus found himself at the center of attention in a way he'd spent years trying to avoid, his carefully maintained anonymity crumbling around a demonstration of skills he couldn't take back. "I did some military service," Marcus admitted reluctantly, knowing that half-truths were sometimes more dangerous than complete silence. Some military service? This came from Dale, who had abandoned his crossword entirely and approached with newfound interest. Mister, I was Army for 12 years, and I never saw anyone shoot like that. What unit were you with? Marcus felt the familiar weight of operational security pressing against his chest. His service record was classified at levels that most people couldn't even name. His missions conducted in places that officially didn't exist for reasons that were buried in intelligence files that would remain sealed for decades. He had been, quite literally, one of the deadliest snipers in the world's most elite military unit, with confirmed kills that numbered in the dozens and operations that had shaped the course of conflicts most people never knew had happened. British military, Marcus said finally, hoping that would be enough to satisfy their curiosity. British? Chuck had finally torn himself away from the target, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine bewilderment. What the hell is a Brit doing in Millbrook? It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had hoped never to have to answer. The truth was complicated, involving years of therapy, medical discharge, and a desperate need to disappear into anonymity after a career that had demanded everything and given back trauma that medicine was still learning how to treat. His move to America had been part of a carefully planned rehabilitation, recommended by psychiatrists who understood that sometimes healing required complete disconnection from the triggers of past trauma. Dual citizenship, Marcus explained, which was technically true but hardly the complete story. My mother was American. More people had gathered now, drawn by word of the incredible shooting display. Someone had posted a photo of the target on social media, and Marcus could see phones buzzing with incoming messages and notifications. His quiet anonymity was dissolving in real time, replaced by the kind of attention he'd spent years trying to avoid. So what kind of British military? The question came from an older man Marcus recognized as a regular but had never spoken to. SAS? The two letters hung in the air like an accusation. The Special Air Service was legendary even among military circles, known for operations that pushed the boundaries of human capability and selection processes that broke more candidates than they accepted. For someone to casually guess his actual unit affiliation meant that his cover was thinner than he'd believed. Marcus met the older man's eyes and saw recognition there, the look of someone who had served in special operations and recognized the signs in others. The way Marcus held himself, moved with economy of motion, and demonstrated skills that went far beyond civilian training. His secret was out, not through any dramatic revelation but through the simple application of abilities he couldn't hide once demonstrated. Yes, Marcus said quietly, SAS. The admission sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Even Chuck seemed to deflate, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching awe. The Special Air Service had a reputation that transcended national boundaries, known for producing soldiers who operated at the very edge of human capability. How many tours? The older man asked, his voice respectful now. 4, Marcus replied, though the number hardly captured the reality of deployments that had blended together into a decade-long mission of surgical violence applied with mathematical precision. Afghanistan? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Marcus found himself answering questions he'd sworn never to discuss, the weight of maintained secrecy finally overwhelming his desire for privacy. Other places. The crowd had grown larger now, with people from other ranges and even some from the parking lot coming to see what the commotion was about. Word was spreading through social media, with photos of the target being shared and commented on by people Marcus had never met. His identity as the quiet black security guard was being replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. Jesus Christ, Chuck muttered, looking between Marcus and the target. I was giving shit to an SAS sniper. There was genuine contrition in his voice now, the kind of embarrassment that came from realizing how badly he'd misjudged a situation. His friends Jerry and Diesel looked equally uncomfortable, their earlier amusement at Marcus's expense replaced by the dawning realization of just how foolish they'd been. I owe you an apology, Chuck continued, extending his hand. I was way out of line. Marcus studied the offered hand for a moment, then shook it. He'd learned to recognize genuine remorse from the performed version, and Chuck's discomfort seemed authentic. Apology accepted, Marcus said simply. But the damage was done. His cover was blown, his anonymity destroyed by 5 shots that had been too perfect to explain away. Within hours, the story would be all over local social media, then picked up by military forums and news outlets hungry for feel-good stories about veterans. His quiet life in Millbrook was over, replaced by attention he neither wanted nor needed. Dale approached with obvious nervousness, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by stammering respect. "Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize for how I've treated you. If I'd known." "You didn't know," Marcus interrupted, "and it shouldn't have mattered anyway." The rebuke was gentle but clear. His military service didn't excuse the casual racism he'd endured, just as Dale's ignorance didn't excuse his behavior. Respect shouldn't have to be earned through demonstrations of exceptional ability. It should have been granted as a basic human courtesy. "You're right," Dale admitted, his face flushing red. "You're absolutely right." People were starting to approach Marcus directly now, some wanting to shake his hand, others hoping for stories about his service. He could see the beginning of a crowd that would only grow larger as word spread, the start of a tension that would make his current life impossible to maintain. "I need to go," Marcus said, shouldering his rifle case and heading toward the exit. "Wait," called the older man who had first guessed his unit affiliation. "I'm Tom Rodriguez, retired Green Beret. I know this is probably the last thing you want, but there's a veterans group that meets monthly. Good guys, all special operations. We don't talk about the classified stuff, just help each other adjust." Marcus paused at the door, considering the offer. He'd avoided veteran organizations since his discharge, preferring isolation to the risk of triggering memories better left buried. But the genuine concern in Tom's voice suggested an understanding that might be worth the risk. "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally. As he walked toward his car, Marcus could hear the excited conversations starting up behind him, the range buzzing with an energy that hadn't been there when he'd arrived that morning. His phone was already starting to buzz with notifications as photos and videos of his shooting spread across social media platforms. By the time he reached his apartment, the story had taken on a life of its own. Someone had posted a video of him shooting, taken without his knowledge, and it was being shared across military and shooting forums with titles like SAS Sniper Destroys Racist Bullies and Watch the Special Forces Vet Show How It's Done. The comments sections were filled with praise for his shooting and condemnation of the treatment he'd received. Marcus sat on his couch, staring at his phone as his quiet life unraveled in real time. Within hours, he'd gone from anonymous security guard to internet sensation, his military background exposed and his desire for privacy shattered by 5 shots that had been too perfect to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years learning to disappear, to blend into backgrounds and operate without leaving traces. But in the end, it was his very expertise that had given him away, skills too refined to be explained by civilian training alone. His phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize, then another call, and another. Messages were pouring in from reporters, military publications, and people claiming to have served with him. The quiet life he'd built in Millbrook was collapsing under the weight of unwanted attention. But perhaps, Marcus thought as he turned off his phone and sat in the gathering darkness of his apartment, it was time to stop hiding anyway. He'd spent 3 years trying to bury the soldier he'd been, but maybe integration was better than isolation. Maybe Tom Rodriguez's veterans group was exactly what he needed, even if he'd never been ready to admit it. The morning sun would rise on a different life, one where Marcus Thompson was no longer anonymous but not necessarily unwelcome. The shooting range that had been a refuge might now be impossible to visit, but other opportunities might present themselves. Teaching, perhaps, or consulting work that used his skills without requiring him to relive his trauma. Outside his window, Millbrook continued its quiet existence, unaware that one of the world's most elite soldiers had been living among them, enduring their prejudices with the same stoic precision he'd once applied to impossible shots in impossible situations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Marcus Thompson allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that his story wasn't over, just entering a new chapter. The last shot had been fired, but the target was just the beginning.